Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Lopez Matthews Jr., and I am the chair of the Asala TV committee. And thank you for joining us for tonight's Black History Month presentation, The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn, with Amrita Chakrabarti Myers. And before I bring her on the screen, because she is here, I'm just going to read her bio quickly. Amrita Chakrabarti Myers is the Director of Graduate Studies and the Ruth N. Hall's Full Professor of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. She earned her doctorate in U.S. history from Rutgers University and specializes in Black women's history in the slave South. A consulting editor with the Journal of American History, Myers is also a committed activist, both on and off campus. She is regularly interviewed by media outlets ranging from PBS to NPR to Fox News on issues of race and gender justice, and has published editorials and articles on policing, anti-Blackness, and racism writ large in the Washington Post and the Louisville Courier-Journal. Her first book, Forging Freedom, Black Women in the Pursuit of Liberty in Antebellum Charleston, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2011 and received several book awards, including the 2012 Julia Cherry Spruill Book Prize from the Southern Association of Women Historians and the 2011 Anna Julia Cooper CLR James Book Prize from the National Council for Black Studies. And her second book is The Vice President's Black Wife, The Untold Life of Julia Chinn, which we will be discussing this evening. And so thank you for joining us, Dr. Myers.
Good to be here, Dr. Matthews. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you all for being here and being in the chat. Now, if you have questions for Dr. Myers, please place them in the chat during our conversation, and we will address them at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to jump in with our first question. Most people don't know much about the life of Julia Chinn, since she has not really been covered in history books. And so can you tell us a little bit about who Julia Chinn was?
Sure thing. And welcome everybody out in the ether. It's a little difficult to see anyone, but I know you're out there. So Julia Chinn was an enslaved woman. She was born at some point in the 1790s in Kentucky, and she was enslaved. Her mother, and her brother were all enslaved by Robert and Jemima Suggett, who had moved out with a number of other folks from Virginia to settle the Kentucky territory. Julia was so she was raised on the senior Johnson's farm, which was called Johnson Fort or Johnson Station. And then when she was about 5 or 6 years old, Mrs. Johnson, Jemima Richards, who was Richard's mother, actually pulled her out of the quarters and brought her into the main house to begin training her as a domestic enslaved laborer. And so she spent the next several years working with the house staff, other older enslaved Black women. And then when she was about 13 or 14 years old, she and her brother, along with about 100 enslaved laborers, were transferred to Richard Johnson, who was one of the Johnson's sons. They had a fairly large family. Richard was a politician. He had started out as a state legislator, and then he became a federal senator. He was a congressman. And so he eventually wanted to have his own home. And so he established his own farm just a couple of miles away from his parents. But he needed laborers to help him get the farm up and running because plantations were businesses. They needed labor. And so his parents transferred 100 laborers over to him, and that included Julia Chinn and her brother Daniel. Their mother, Henrietta, however, remained behind at Johnson Fort, where they had grown up. So it's only 2 miles, and so we don't think 2 miles is very far these days, but we're talking about enslaved folks who don't have freedom of bodily movement and who don't have access to carriages and other forms of transportation. And so 2 miles may well have seemed like 200. So Julia and Daniel are transferred to Blue Spring Farm, which is Richard's plantation in Scott County, Kentucky. And very quickly, Julia becomes tapped to be the the head of the domestic staff at Blue Spring Farm. Richard's mother basically said to him, "You need, a manager, right, to oversee everything for you." And she basically is the one who chooses Julia. She already knows who she is because she's helped to train her. So Julia moves into the main house. She oversees the staff. She's in charge of organizing large parties because Richard is a very popular young man. He's also a very powerful politician. He's a war hero from the war of, he's going to be a war hero from the War of 1812. He loves to entertain. So she's responsible for putting together these parties. She oversees the house staff, including their work assignments as well as punishments. She purchases, she buys and sells for the plantation. She'll sign contracts on behalf of Richard when he's not in Kentucky, when he's living in DC, which is 6 months of every year. So she has her fingers in a lot of different pies because Richard isn't married, right? Julia is the overseer, the mistress of the plantation in that sense. And within a year of her joining the house staff and becoming the overseer of the house staff, she ends up becoming his Richard's sexual partner as well. We don't know how that relationship began in terms of the levels of coercion that may or may not have been involved. We do know that she was only 13 or 14 years old, and Richard at this point would have been 30 or 31. And very shortly thereafter, she gave birth to their first daughter, Imogene. For the next 23, 24 years, Richard and Julia would be seen in their local communities as a couple. Richard never married a white woman. He did not have a white family. Julia and he lived together. They ended up having two daughters together. It was very openly acknowledged that this was his family. Julia was his wife. Imogene and Adeline were his children. He had his daughters educated. When they got older, he arranged marriages for them with local white men who knew exactly who these women were and who their mother was. He also transferred a large amounts of property to them, land, enslaved laborers, cash, and he made sure to help his grandchildren as well. Julia had a really, really busy life. She was, for all intents and purposes, the mistress of Blue Spring Farm, and she had the workload that came along with it. She did basic daily labor, not only taking care of her own children, but overseeing all the cooking, all the cleaning, the sewing for the household, for the enslaved laborers on the plantation. As I said before, she had access to Richard's lines of credit. She did buying and selling for the plantation, everything from food to, mechanical instruments and tools that were necessary. She was responsible for everything because he was gone for 6 months of the year. So from discipline to dances, right, from soirees to making supper, she was in charge. And this was a 2,000-acre plantation. There were grist mills, sawmills. There was a lot of work to be done every single day, and she was in charge of it all. And she was in charge of it from the time she was only 14 or 15 years old, which is an incredibly large burden to consider when you think about, duties and work for a young teenager who was also a mother.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very fascinating. And before I move on, I just want you to share with us what your Zoom background is so that people know the synchronicity.
No, absolutely. So the scene that you see behind me is one piece of the original Blue Spring Farm property where Julia and Richard and their daughters lived. The property is no longer in the hands of the family. It's not a working plantation, certainly. It's also not, unlike Henry Clay's plantation site, Ashland, it's not a tourist site. It is now owned by at least four different households, families. Um, so it's no longer that one large 2,000-acre piece. But I've had the good fortune to be able to spend a lot of time in Kentucky and go to visit the sites where Julia herself would have walked, where her daughters would have spent time, including the main home site here. And I wanted to put this background up, one, because we're talking about Julia today and about Black women and labor during the era of slavery, as well as in the present moment, because the present and the past are so deeply connected. But I also think it's important to put this particular image up because we don't know exactly where Julia Chinn is buried. Um, she's not in the local church cemetery where the family attended church. And she's not buried beside Richard, who's buried in the main sort of dignitaries cemetery in Frankfort, Kentucky, which is the state capital. Most likely she's buried somewhere here on the farm, the original farm, because that's what people did in the 19th century is they buried their kinfolk on their land. And so we don't know where the graveyards are at this point. Everything, the markers have, you know, been lost to time. Everything's kind of been covered over by grass and shrubbery. But we know that she's definitely out there somewhere. And so that's why I wanted to have this photograph up here to represent
Awesome. Now, you're quoted as saying that nobody knew who she was. The truth is
that.
that Julia and Richard are both victims of legacies of enslavement, interracial sex, and silence around Black women's histories. Now, could you explain this for our viewers?
No, absolutely. The more I did research on Julia and her daughters, Imogene and Adeline, the more I was both shocked and not shocked, I suppose, to realize how almost entirely they had been erased from national memory and from the sort of, main narrative of US history. And part of me wasn't surprised because as a scholar of Black women's history and slavery, I'm really well aware of the fact that the brick and mortar archives were never meant to hold the documents and the stories of enslaved women, of Black people, of Indigenous people, even of white women. And it's only almost accidentally in some ways that their documents end up there. They're created by, systems of power, empire, colonialism, and white supremacy, and they're meant to really talk about white folks. They're meant to talk about the property that white folks own and the property that white folks transfer and tax. But that property is not just homes and land; it's also people. And so, by looking at the archives and understanding who created them and for what purpose, we can still glean information on the lives of Black women by looking at those records, wills, estate records, legal documents, petitions to the state legislature, tax books, etc. But when I started this project, I assumed that it was going to be easier to find information on Julia because she was, for almost a quarter century, the partner of a very prominent politician, a man who was the son of one of the first families of Kentucky. Richard's father, Robert, signed the state constitution. His brothers and they became, federal judges and attorney generals and congressmen, and he became a vice president. So I thought, well, this is going to be easier in terms of doing the research. This is a powerful man from a powerful family. He was a politician. He was a vice president. There's going to be a large library. There's going to be materials at the Library of Congress. And there's going to be materials all over Kentucky. There's going to be plantation records, letters, diaries, all kinds of things. I deluded myself a little bit, I think. And the more research I did, the more I came to realize that none of those things existed. And I was shocked. Richard had been in politics for almost 45 years. And there's no Richard Mentor Johnson Vice Presidential Library. There's no major collection of archival materials in Washington, D.C., or anywhere else in Kentucky. And the more research I did, the more I thought to myself, this is really odd. I mean, how is it that Henry Clay, who is a contemporary of Johnson's and who lives relatively close up the road, there's so much information on Clay. And Clay didn't, Clay was, they came of age together in Congress. They were sort of freshmen, right? Reps together. Richard becomes a hero of the War of 1812, right? He's shot 5 times. He almost dies. So how come, like Henry Clay, who's from Kentucky, who's also a famous politician, how come Clay is like one of the favorite sons of Kentucky and nobody knows who Johnson is? So nobody knows who Johnson is. No one talks about him. No one's writing books about him. The last biography was published in 1932 of Johnson. And there's even less on Julia. When I started researching Julia online, I found references to materials that had been published about Choctaw Academy, a Native American boarding school on the property. Those articles had been published back in, the 1920s, 30s, 40s. At that point, Christina Snyder's book on Choctaw Academy called Great Crossings had not yet been written. So I was horrified. I was like not shocked, but also shocked that how do we have this level of erasure? No one's talking about Richard. There's no biography on Richard since 1932. No one's really talking about Julia. When her name does come up, it's about how she's the quote unquote concubine, the mulatto concubine, right? That's and it's like all of these headlines, like these sort of internet clickbaity kind of articles where the headlines are like really salacious. They're like, oh, the vice president and his mulatto mistress. These are not pieces that are scholarly. They're not well researched. They're not archivally driven. They're really more about sort of, voyeurism, if to put a fine point on it. And I realized especially when I met the family, I met descendants of Richard and Julia, and came to find out that even most of them, had not known their own lineage and heritage. They didn't know that they were descended from a vice president and his enslaved Black wife. And this is a country where we all talk all the time about, oh, I'm descended from a president, a famous general, a vice president, or just, the Puritans, right? Mayflower. And yet nobody's talking about the fact that they're descended from Richard Mentor Johnson because most of them don't know. Well, why don't they know? Why wouldn't their ancestors have proudly talked about the fact that they were descended from a vice president? At some point, and that's when I realized, right, the levels of erasure were vast. It's not just erasure at the sort of national level in terms of the major narratives of US history. It's not just erasure in terms of the state of Kentucky. It's not about the fact that Richards was a vice president and not a president. It's the fact that even at the very smallest level of kinship and family and blood and household, most families descended from Imogene, the oldest daughter, who lived a long life and had many children. At some point in the late 19th, early 20th century, during Jim Crow, when the violence was really high, these are folks who are still, many of them are, right, they're still in Kentucky. They choose to stop telling their children and grandchildren about their heritage. They quietly cross the color line, and they do so with the full knowledge of the white community that they're living in, because the white folks know who these people are. They know that they're descendants of Johnson and Julia Chinn. They've always known that. But at some point, everyone sort of makes a quiet agreement that they're just going to not talk about it anymore. And so these folks cross the color line. They're openly living as white people, going to church as white folks. All the census records refer to them as white. And they stop telling their kids and their grandkids the truth. And it's not until the 1990s that most of these folks, and I talk about this in my book, I interview a lot of the descendants, the ones who were willing to speak to me. I so appreciate the fact that they did. And they tell me how they discovered the truth of their family history. And, literally for one woman, it was like a box in the attic, which sent her down a rabbit hole. And because of things like ancestry.com and early sort of internet work in the 1990s, family members begin discovering that they trace back to a vice president and an enslaved woman. And so I really believe that this is erasure because of race, it's erasure because of interracial sex, and it's erasure because of slavery. If Richard Johnson had had a traditional wife, meaning white, and a traditional life, right, married to a white woman, white children, if he had done what other slave owners did, many of them, which is have a white family out front and then have their Black family hidden in the back in the quarters, I think we would know much more about Richard Johnson. I think we would know much more about his whole life. But instead, his relationship with Julia is super public. He never hides it. He never tries to pretend or lie about, right, the fact that she is, right, the mother of his children, right, the head in front of his household. They entertain ex-presidents, they entertain the Marquis de Lafayette. People are coming in and out for parties all the time, right? Washington, like high Washington officials, international celebrities. And Julia's there. She organizes everything, right? She entertains. Like I said, she's buying and selling on behalf of the plantation, signing, right, contracts. She was a literate woman. So were her daughters. They could read and write. Their daughters were there. His daughters met the Marquis. They played the piano for the Marquis de Lafayette. So all of this is out in the open. There's no hiding. And I think that's exactly why we don't know who they are, because it's an embarrassment. Right? Everyone knows, but no one is happy about this. And the embarrassment comes to the forefront in particular when Richard chooses to run on the Martin Van Buren ticket as Van Buren's vice president in the election of 1836. That's when it becomes really, really, I mean, it had always been tense and contentious, but then it becomes really ugly because even people within his own party don't want him running on the vice president for the vice presidency. It's okay if he's a senator or a congressman, they can kind of ignore him. They can pretend that he's a bachelor, pretend Julia doesn't exist because she's in Kentucky, not in DC. But if he's like the number two on the ticket and they win, he's a hair's breadth away from the White House if anything happens to Van Buren. And then that means that his Black wife and Black children, right, become like part of Washington's social life. Like, is he going to bring his family to DC into the White House? Like, it's all of these horrors. And so even members of his own party aren't happy about this and start moving against him. When he dies, his brothers, his two brothers who are still alive, have him declared deceased, say that he died intestate without a will, and take whatever property he has left. It's not much. He's given almost everything away by notarized deed to his daughters and grandchildren, but whatever he has left, they take. And that means that they take control of his entire estate, including all of his records, his papers, letters, plantation journals, everything. Nothing is in an archive anywhere. Nothing was donated to a college or a university, not University of Kentucky, not Transylvania, where he supposedly went, studied law. No, it's gone. And I think that the brothers, right, they were humiliated by their brother's life. They wish that he had just had a white wife or, been a bachelor, or even if he had had all of these sexual relationships with Black women, just shut up about it. And he didn't. And I'm like 99.9% sure that they destroyed everything. I think they burned everything to a crisp. And this is why we don't know. They were like, can we erase her? Can we erase anything about her, her daughters, the grandchildren? And to a large extent they did, but they couldn't get rid of everything. They couldn't get rid of the newspapers. They couldn't get rid of the church records, right? The parish registers. They couldn't get rid of the tiny bit of business correspondence that was sitting in the Library of Congress archives. They couldn't get rid of the letters that Richard wrote to other people. So they could destroy anything in Richard's possession, but not what he had sent to other folks. But by destroying his papers, they would have destroyed all the letters that Julia, Imogene, and Adeline wrote to Richard every year when he lived in DC. So that's what really breaks my heart. But so it made the research much more difficult, right? Much more contentious, much more complicated long term because I had to spend years, right, digging up bits and pieces, shreds and fragments from all over the country, from Arizona to Washington, D.C., to Ohio, to Kentucky, to Kansas, trying to piece together Julia's life because the records had been destroyed in an effort to erase her and her daughter's existence from the face of the earth. And because, so that I think that the erasure has happened on a number of levels because of the embarrassment that people felt within his own party, within his own family.
That's so fascinating, especially as you mentioned how people felt uncomfortable about his situation. And I know that you mentioned that he allowed the Choctaw Academy for Indigenous Americans to be built on his grounds.
Mm,
Now, during this time, he paid the headmaster, Thomas Henderson, to educate his daughters for a future as free women.
hmm
And they were also allowed to marry white men. Now,
hmm
given the time, how do you think he was able to manage this, especially considering the hostility that he would have encountered?
Yeah, I mean, and I really think that this is where Julia's sort of networking abilities come into play, right? Like she didn't obtain a whole lot for herself, right? She died an enslaved woman. She never gained her freedom. She never owned property in her own name. She was never formally educated, and her marriage to Richard, some people say that they actually had a wedding ceremony, but it was not legally recognized by the state of Kentucky because Kentucky did not legally recognize interracial marriages at that time. So, all of the things that Julia never acquired for herself, she labored very, very hard to make sure that her daughters, grandchildren, her descendants had everything she did not. So, because of the fact that she had, right, this position in the house, she used that position to bring her family members, her brother, her sister-in-law, her nieces and nephews. she used her position to bring them into the household. And by placing them in the household, she also then was able to help them acquire an education because Richard uses his power in the political realm to have Choctaw Academy, which is a Native American boarding school for Indigenous boys, young boys and young men, to be housed on his property. He wanted it because he saw it as being a cash cow. He didn't do it because he had such love for Indigenous people, right? In my opinion, having looked at the records. He had made a name for himself as a war hero from the War of 1812, and in particular, said he claimed to have killed Tecumseh in battle. He likely did not kill Tecumseh in battle, but that was how he sort of, situated himself as he was shot 5 times in the Battle of the Thames. That's the battle in which he killed Tecumseh, all of those things. So when there's conversations between the federal government and the Choctaw Nation about, as part of a larger set of treaty negotiations, building a school for Choctaw boys, right? These are the sons of elders, chieftains, right? The top elite of the Choctaw Nation. They wanted a school that was going to teach their children, their sons, right, give them a classical education, like not vocational or religious education, but the kind of education that white boys had access to, so that when their kids grew up, they would be able to take over as the next generation of elders, leaders, chiefs, teachers of their own people, and be able to go toe to toe with white congressmen and senators and politicians and lawyers to make sure that they didn't get cheated in their treaty negotiations. So this was a very calculated move on the part of the Choctaw Nation. Richard desperately wants to have this on his property because he's like, oh, the Choctaw are going to be sending money, right, for tuition. The federal government is going to be sending money for tuition and expenses. I'm going to take all that. If it's on my land, I'm going to take all this money and I'm going to use Julia and my enslaved laborers to do all the work. It's a boarding school. So all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the sewing of the clothes, all the healthcare and medical, provisions, everything is going to be done by his enslaved staff. And Julia's going to have to oversee it all. And so he has visions of dollar signs dancing in his eyes because he's almost always skating on the edge of bankruptcy. He's always in debt, right? He lived well outside his means, right? The parties, making loans to people. He was constantly in and out of court, that sort of thing. So, this creates, so Choctaw Academy is opened on the farm, and Richard and Julia attend Great Crossing Baptist Church, which is just a couple of miles away from their home. It's the church that Richard's parents helped to found, and that's the church that they attend. And one of the rotating ministers at that church, because back in the day, churches didn't meet every Sunday. They didn't have one full-time minister. They had part-time ministers who rotated through the pulpit who also had full-time jobs. So Thomas Henderson was one of those rotating ministers at Great Crossing Baptist Church. So he had known Richard and his family a long time. And so Richard is able to use his influence to have Henderson named headmaster of Choctaw Academy. But Richard's not there for half the year. So who's doing all the work? Thomas is responsible for overseeing the teachers and the students and the disciplining of the students as well as their education. It's Julia and all of the enslaved laborers that she oversees that do all the washing of the clothes and the bedding, that help make sure that the rooms are kept tidy, who oversee all the cooking for the boys 3 times a day, right? Julia, who has a lot of medical skills, who oversees the health, right? Any kind of illness or anything, any kind of like injury, she takes that over. So healthcare, food, preparing, like making clothing, buying cloth and sewing all the clothing, right? Doing all the washing. So there's a whole team of laundresses, there's seamstresses, right? There's cooks, people who have to clean the dining hall, clean the dormitory buildings. Julia is overseeing all of this, making sure furniture is made for the dormitories. She's responsible for all of it, right? But she works with Henderson. They basically become an overseeing team of Choctaw Academy and Blue Spring Farm. Now, one of the things that Richard basically says to Thomas is, I'm going to give you this job. I'm going to make sure you get it, and I'm going to make sure that you are paid really well for it, and you're going to get room and board in a home on Blue Spring Farm for you, your wife, and your kids. But in addition to being headmaster of Choctaw Academy, you have to educate my people, my house staff, my family. And so in the evenings and on weekends, in all of his free time, Henderson is expected to come to the house and teach the house staff. So the fact that this is Julia, right? She's moved all of her family members, extended kin into the household to the best of her ability. And because of that, brothers, sisters, sister-in-laws, nieces, nephews, daughters, they all get educated by Thomas Henderson. And well educated. He's a classically trained person. In addition to being a minister, that's why the federal government agreed to make him headmaster of Choctaw Academy. And the education that the boys were receiving at Choctaw Academy was parallel to none in Kentucky at that point. In fact, it was so good that local white families petitioned to let their white sons come to school at Choctaw Academy. It wasn't supposed to be for white kids, it was only supposed to be for the Choctaw boys. But the education was so good that white families they demanded that their sons be allowed to get educated there as well. So that shows you the level of education that the children were receiving at Choctaw. They were learning Greek, Latin, math, English, grammar. Like, it was a classical education in every sense of the word, science, astronomy, you name it. And that's what Adeline and Imogene were being taught as well, alongside their cousins and other extended family members. And so Henderson has a big job, but in the long run, it positions Adeline and Imogene and their cousins and other relatives for freedom, right? If they become manumitted, they're going to be better able to find jobs as free people. If they run away, they're going to be able to better find jobs in urban areas as free people. They have skills, right? Not just manual skills in terms of cooking, sewing, washing, cleaning. They're also going to have skills in terms of literacy, which are going to stand them in good stead. And for Imogene and Adeline, as they grow older, it makes them better potential, wives for suitors because they're well educated. Henderson actually says that these two girls were as educated as any other, woman of their era. Like, that's saying something, right? That in terms of how intelligent they were, how successful they were in their studies. So Richard and Julia collectively make sure that they position their daughters, right, to be well educated, to be able to attract good suitors, right, and eventually become plantation owners themselves. They become plantation mistresses. They own hundreds of acres. They have enslaved laborers of their own, right? They become very wealthy women who are overseeing and sort of acting on a very, elite level in terms of their abilities because of the childhood that their mother's sacrifices gave them.
So you kind of touched on a little bit about how unique their lives were,
Hmm.
but I would say, how does this situation in their lives compare to the lives of other enslaved Black women during this period? Just to give some context to our viewers.
Of course. I think that it's really I think that we sometimes, or often maybe even, think that all enslaved women's lives looked the same. And the more work that has been done in the last, 2 or 3 decades, the more we've come to understand that there was not one kind of enslaved woman's life, right? That enslaved women in the North had lives that looked different from enslaved women in the South. That Black women who were laboring on cotton plantations versus tobacco or hemp or rice, their lives looked different from one another in certain ways. That if you were on a small farm versus a large plantation, your life was going to look different. If you were an urban slave versus an enslaved rural laborer, your life was going to look different. If you worked in the fields versus as a skilled carpenter or stonemason, a pastry chef, right? Everyone's like, there are certain generalities we can make about slavery and enslavement, and other things that are going to be different given where you're enslaved, right? North or south, urban or rural, industrial, right? Working for, like, enslaved by the railroad or a company, versus a personal family home, a small farm, a large farm. There are lots of other women out there who had lives like Julia's, right? Sally Hemings isn't the only person who was involved, right, with a powerful politician like Thomas Jefferson. There's a small handful of books that have now been written and come out about women who were involved in, right, who were, involved in these long-term, I don't know, relationship is a sort of a slippery word to use, but in these long-term situations, right, sexual situations. Mary Lumpkin comes to mind, right? That there's a book that's just recently been published on Mary Lumpkin, the Devil's Half Acre, Julia Chinn, Sally Hemings, um, Anna Kingsley in Florida, and then the Hunt Logan Alexander family in rural Georgia that Adele Alexander has written about. There's also Amanda America Dixon and her mother Julia, who are enslaved, right? And it's the mother who has this relationship with the owner. These are so there's more. I think there's more and more women out there who had similar situationships. I'm going to call them, right. I had this really great conversation with one of my students just earlier today. And we were talking about the fact that we understand that within the system of slavery, there's always differing levels of coercion. The coercion can be psychological, the coercion can be emotional or mental, it can certainly be physical, right? That there's always coercion. So within that system of always coercion, how can we talk about consent? And I don't really think we can talk about consent necessarily, not in the sense that we would talk about it today when you're free or relatively free and you have the ability to actually make choices, right? If Julia had been freed and if she had chosen to stay with Richard, that would have been much more along the lines of consent. Julia has limited choices, limited opportunities, just like other enslaved women. Her privileges only go but so far. On the plantation, at Choctaw Academy, and to a certain extent at Great Crossing Baptist Church, which made exceptions for her and her daughters because of Richard's connection to a founding family. But this is all within a 2-mile radius of her home. She doesn't have power and privilege in Washington, D.C., where she never goes. She doesn't have power and privileges in places like Lexington or Louisville, which are very close by. I mean, today you can be in Lexington from Scott County in 15, 20 minutes. You can be in Louisville in 35, right, minutes, 30, 35 minutes. These are but so her circle is small. Her level of power and privilege is narrow. And so there are many women who have similar experiences, who experience various levels of coercion and who therefore engage in what I choose to call compliance. That's different from consent. They don't have the ability to engage in full consent because of coercion, because of legalized slavery. But they have limited choices, limited options. They could choose to fight back. They could choose to run away. They could choose to rise up and murder their owners, right? Like Celia does, who most people know a little bit more about Celia, right? Who has a similar, who is at the age of about 14 purchased by a white man and then immediately turned into it's sex trafficking. She's turned into his sex slave, right? Sexual labor is labor. And Celia spends the next 5 years performing sexual labor, right, against her will, but it appears like she's complying because she doesn't necessarily fight back. That doesn't mean that she's choosing this or that she's okay with it, right? So she's definitely been coerced. There's no choice or involved here or consent, but she chooses to comply until she doesn't. Sally Hemings chooses to comply. Julia Chen chooses to comply, right? Julia looks at the options available to her and says, well, I could run away. What's going to happen then? Another woman that Richard is later involved with after Julia passes away does run away. And he sends the full power of the posse after her, his overseer, bounty hunters, everybody to recapture her and bring her back. And when she's brought back, she's beaten, banished to the kitchens, right? And then eventually, from what we understand, sold off the plantation. So Julia knows, like, her partner, right, this man that she's ostensibly married to, he's not an abolitionist. He's not in favor of racial social equality. He is a slave owner, he's a plantation owner. So she knows what's going to happen if she fights back, right? She can fight back, she might end up dead. She can fight back, she might end up being raped anyway. She can run away, she can be caught, brought back, beaten, and then sold. There's all kinds of paths in front of her, none of which are good. So she chooses to comply. By complying, that means more for her children and her descendants than she ever acquires for herself. It means better jobs for her family members. It means literacy and a formal education. It means manumission. It means legal marriages. It means property ownership. So her daughters, her nieces, her extended kin end up right in better situations because of this. This is not, so I want to say, like, in terms of the labor that Julia performs, it's very similar to the labor of so many other enslaved Black women. They're from sun up to sundown. They are sewing, they are cooking, they are cleaning, they're taking care of children, they're taking care of the livestock, right, and the orchards and the gardens. They're washing, right. They're doing all of the, and they're taking care of all the children. They're hosting parties. They're taking care of house guests who might come for weeks or months on end. In terms of the labor that Julia Chinn performs every single day, her life in that sense is no different from other enslaved women. And then when you look at the, what happens because of her, her choosing to comply to Richard, it's not that it changes her amount of labor, right? It gives her a certain amount of privilege on the plantation, which she uses to her advantage to make life better for for her kinfolk and her family. So I would say that what we learn from Julia's life is actually as unique as it seems in some ways, it's actually very similar to many other women, some of whom had, were in compliant relationships with white enslavers, others who were not, but all of whom worked all day, every day. And in fact, it's Julia's labor that kills her. Because I mentioned earlier that one of her skill sets is medicine and health and healing, which she probably learned from her mother and other older enslaved Black women on the plantation where she grew up as a child, Johnson Fort. So she's known for being a very good, doctor. In fact, Richard himself says that she is as good as one half the physicians where the complaint is not serious. That's is a direct quote by him. He never hires a doctor to look after the Choctaw Academy students until after Julia passes away. That's how good of a job she does. But in 1833, there's a cholera epidemic that rages through the South and through Kentucky. It kills hundreds and then thousands of people. And it comes to Georgetown, it comes to Scott County, it comes to Blue Spring Farm. And dozens of people take sick, many, many people die, white folks, enslaved folks, Native American folks. The largest number of folks who pass away are Black folks because of the labor they perform, because of the lack of nutrition in terms of their opportunity to have good food, because of their housing conditions, they're more susceptible to epidemic diseases like malaria and cholera. Julia, of course, is in charge of the cholera ward. She's in charge of nursing all the people who get sick, doctoring them. She commandeers a couple of older Choctaw Academy students, young men, to like be her assistants. And it's because of them that not more people die. But as a result of doing this work in the cholera ward, face to face with all of these very deeply ill people, Julia Chinn eventually takes sick and dies herself. And she's very young. At the most, at this point, she would have been 37. And so Julia labors from the time she's 5, when she's removed from her house and taken away from her mom and put into the main house to learn how to be a domestic laborer. Right? She has to sleep in the main house. She doesn't get to go back home and sleep at home with her mom and her brother. She will only see them on Sundays, if right on holidays, if there's opportunity, if she's not needed in the house. She'll be learning how to cook and clean and do laundry and everything, right? Sewing, hostessing, everything from the time she's 5 or 6 years of age. And then at the age of 13 or 14, she's taken away from the plantation altogether, where she could at least see her mom occasionally, and sent away. Again, a very similar story to so many enslaved women and young men, boys and girls who are taken away from their parents at a young age to be trained, right, by white folks to do certain kinds of labor, children who are sold away from their parents or, gifted away from their parents by their enslavers to other members of their families and are then separated from their loved ones, folks who are put to work 24/7 performing labor in the fields and in the house and in the bedroom. And so, in this way, in terms of her labor from the age of 5 onwards, Julia's life is actually very much like other enslaved girls and women's lives. The difference is that she ends up becoming, right, the sexual property of her owner, and she uses that not to her own advantage, but for the advantage of her kin. But there are other women who are like that as well, who have that opportunity.
No, I'm glad that you mentioned that. It seems like you've answered one of the questions in our chat that said, can you speak about some of the constraints Julia and her daughters were subjected to in the community? I think you did hit on that uh, as you were speaking, but if you maybe hit a little deeper about that, but also
Absolutely,
add an answer
absolutely.
to another question, what was her relationship with her daughters?
So, two-part question, relationship with her daughters. We don't know 100% for sure because, of course, we don't have the girls' letters or Julia's letters, right, to Richard. Richard, however, writes to Thomas Henderson, headmaster of Choctaw Academy, and in those letters, he talks about Julia, he talks about Adeline and Imogene, he mentions the letters they wrote to him, he sometimes quotes them. And so that gives us one way of being able to get into their personal lives, right? I have no doubt in my mind that Julia, like other Black moms, right, are is very careful to make sure that her daughters, right, receive every advantage, but keeping them close, right, making sure that they go to church, which the family does, and using her position as Richard's wife, right, to make sure that the family gets seats in church that are on the floor, not up in the balcony where other enslaved folks are going to sit. But not at the front of the floor, at the very back of the floor where white people can kind of ignore them because they're behind them. But so she's using that positionality to make sure that, okay, she keeps her daughters close. She sews beautiful dresses for them when the Marquis de Lafayette comes to visit so that they can, entertain the Marquis on the piano. She makes sure that they're given piano lessons, which is something that is usually reserved for elite white women. So every opportunity that she can give to them, from a formal education to beautiful clothes to making sure she takes them to church, right? Even when Richard is not in Kentucky, he's in DC, right? She and her daughters, like, she'll take them to church. Every advantage that she can give them in terms of education, religion, right? Opportunities to meet and mingle with really elite people like presidents and visiting dignitaries, the opportunity to learn musical instruments, all of these things. She navigates for this. She places herself in a situation where she can always make sure that she is putting her daughters forward in the best way possible. And it works, right? It works. Um, Adeline, unfortunately, will die very young. She will marry, she will have one child, and then she will die shortly after her mother. Actually, Julia dies in 33. Adeline will pass away in 1835, 1836, as Richard is running for the vice presidency. Um, Imogene, right, marries, stays in the area, becomes a very prominent property holder, very, very committed to her church life. Right? I mean, very much like her mother. Her mother was referred to as a very pious woman. She was also referred to as a very pious woman. Imogene, when she passes away, there's an obituary that talks about how respected she was in the community, right, by her church. She was a wonderful helpmeet to her husband, an amazing mother, a God-fearing woman, all of these things. So this makes it sound like that the family had no troubles in the local community, that everybody really accepted them, that they had no pushback. That's not true. So, and I want to touch now on that first part of the question, which is how did people really respond to this family, right? Keep in mind that Richard never took his family to Washington, D.C. There's a reason for that, right? He, first of all, he needed Julia in Kentucky at Blue Spring doing labor, taking care of all his land, all his businesses, all his finances, accounts. He needed her there, right? She was the unpaid overseer of Blue Spring Farm. And so he never took her. As much as he wrote about his love for his daughters, he never took his daughters either because he knew that that would be crossing a bridge too far. In DC, people could refer to him as a bachelor, even though pillow talk was, well, he has a black wife and these two biracial children, these two quote unquote yellow daughters, right? Using the language of the era, right? They used all of these really, but so this was all kind of like cocktail party gossip, pillow talk, but in open, it was like, oh, well, Johnson is a bachelor. Well, but everybody knows he's not. In the local community, it's a little more complicated, right? They can't ignore the fact that Richard has this black family because they're right there. They see them when they come to Blue Spring Farm. They do business with Julia, right? She's coming into town to buy and to go to the stores and to like purchase things for the plantation. And she and her daughters are in church, right? Once or twice. I mean, church is like one or two Sundays a month, but those one or two Sundays a month, that's where they are, sitting right there. And so you see, so they have to sort of, it's like seeing and not seeing. It's the silent, it's like the open secret, right? In the community. Like everybody knows, everybody understands, everybody comes to Blue Spring and they eat the food and drink the wine and dance until wee hours of the night, understanding who the girls are who are playing the piano for the marquee, understanding who the hostess is that's organized the whole party. But when Julia leaves the farm to go into town or go to church, there are boundary lines that are drawn. And we see that from looking at the newspaper articles that are published in Kentucky and in other states around the country. They talk, I mean, yes, they have seats at church, but not, up at the front of the floor or even in the middle of the floor at the very back. But okay, it's not up in the balcony. When Julia dies, she's not buried in the church graveyard where Richard's family is all buried. And she's not buried beside him in the Frankfurt Cemetery for dignitaries. We don't know where she's buried, right? We've literally, as I've said several times before in many places, we literally lost the vice president's wife. We would not have lost her if she was white. We would know where her grave was. There would be a marker. But should we lose her because we don't want her, like we collectively as a nation, right? We don't want to remember this. So she's not allowed to be buried in the churchyard. Part of that is probably because she dies during a cholera epidemic. But I highly doubt she would have been buried there even if it wasn't a cholera epidemic, right? If everybody was so like amenable to this, then they could have like, buried Richard next to her. That doesn't happen. So, do the girls go to a formal school? They don't. They're well educated, but they're educated at home by Thomas Henderson evenings and weekends. So, you begin to see where these lines are drawn. Like it seems like the community is super accepting, but only to a point. The daughters don't go to a regular school with other young white women, a finishing school. They don't. They're educated at home. They go to church, but they sit at the back and they're not buried in the church graveyard, right? Adeline isn't buried in the church graveyard and she didn't die during a cholera epidemic. Other things, when Richard tries to take his daughters to a 4th of July barbecue in the community, in town, their town, Georgetown, where they live. It's a big 4th of July celebration. Everyone's there, and he's one of the main speakers for the event. He takes his younger daughter with him. She goes to, there's a tent that's been set up, there's dancing happening, right? Lots of people are talking, drinking, having a great time, and she goes to sit under the tent, the ladies' tent. And the minute she sits down, it's like everything comes to a screeching halt. Music stops, dancing stops, everybody stops talking, and everyone's horrified. And there's a group that's sent to go to the organizers of the party, the ball, the barbecue, and say, you gotta get rid of her. She can't be sitting here with respectable women, with our wives and daughters and mothers, right? Doesn't matter that Richard is this, famous politician and war hero and that he's an invited speaker. And so they go and they say to Richard, she got to go. You got to take her, right? And he says, she is as well educated as any woman here. And they say it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Because her mother is an enslaved Black woman. That means by law, she is technically also an enslaved Black woman. And she's of courting age. She would have been 15 or 16. And the horrors. What if a white man asks her to dance? Right? What if young white men begin interacting with her and thinking, oh, well, she's here. How about I ask to call on her and begin, courting her? So this is all of the stuff that's raging through white people's minds. So they have to get her out of there. These are the same people who come to Blue Spring for the parties and the dances and all of that. And they eat the food and drink the wine. No, but and they even see them at church on Sunday. But it's like, oh no, we'll come to your house and maybe we'll let you sit with us at the back of church. But don't you be coming to our balls and our parties and dancing with our sons and sitting with our wives and mothers and daughters under the tent. No. So Richard has to remove her. He puts her back in their carriage. He makes his speech and then he gets in the carriage and leaves. He doesn't stay because he's livid. He's really, really angry. So this kind of begins to show you the pushback, right? There's a lot of angry editorials in the paper by local townspeople who are upset that Julia has the nerve to ride around town in a carriage. Carriages are reserved for people of a certain class. They're reserved for elite white women. Who does she think she is riding around town in the Johnson carriage? So they're mad that she rides in a carriage. They're upset that the daughters come to these parties. They're furious that they are being forced to accept, right? They were okay when it was just like, okay, they're here, but just ignore them. Okay, we won't make a fuss. We'll just ignore them. But now they're being asked to accept, to face and accept, and they will not do it. And so this pushback is a big part of what I talk about in the book. The book is like, it starts with, I call it a sunshine to shadows book, because the first few chapters, it seems like everything is like really like great. And then you begin to peel back the layers of the onion and you see all the shadows, all the darkness, and how the privilege only goes but so far.
So I have a short question, then I have one that might take a little longer because I am looking at our time and our hours moving away. So how old were her daughters after she passed away?
Um, no. So Julia dies in 1833
Mhm.
in our cholera epidemic. By the time she dies, both of her daughters are married. One, Imogene, the older daughter, is married and living. Richard and Julia made sure that both daughters were given land. And so Imogene is given a huge piece of property in a notarized deed in conjunction with her husband the day after she gets married. And it's like diagonally across the creek. So very close to mom and dad, but their own big plantation property. So she's living there with her husband, Daniel, and her children. Imogene so she's the elder, and she was born in 1812. And so she would have been 21 when her mother passed away in 1833, if I'm doing the math correctly. 1812, yeah, 21.
Okay.
We don't have records of birth for Adeline, but given other kinds of records that talk about the girls, sometimes they would even confuse them for twins. They were very close in age. They looked very similar to one another. And so given it's timing wise, it's fairly certain that most likely what happened is Julia got pregnant with Adeline when Richard came home after the war, like after being injured during the War of 1812. And he's convalescing at home for several months because he was shot 5 times and almost died. And so by the time Adeline is born, it's going to be roughly circa 1814. It means 2 years age difference between the two girls in terms of sort of doing this sort of kind of work that, historical private detectives get to do in terms of figuring it out. And so that would have meant that Adeline was roughly 19 when her mother passed away. And after Julia passed away, Adeline is married. She has one son. She's deeded the Blue Spring Farm main home property. So Richard and Julia give their older daughter a piece of property that's across the creek. They give Adeline and her husband the home property where they live. So Adeline and her husband are living there. Adeline has her first child there. And then when her mother dies, she steps into her mother's shoes and she does all the labor that her mother was doing. She oversees the house staff. She's responsible for taking care of the clothing and the cooking and the sewing for the students of Choctaw Academy, right? She's doing all the labor that her mother was responsible for in taking care of guests and parties and all of that at 19. As a young wife and mother, this is now becomes her life because her own mother passes away.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very fascinating conversation, and I thank you so much for taking the time to come speak with us. And if
Well,
you
it
would
was
like
really
to
my
learn
pleasure.
more,
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm chuckling because you've said fascinating 3 times this in the past hour, Dr. Matthews.
well, I'm in, and I could talk to you all night, but I know we have to
I
bring it to a
know.
close sometime. I'm in. So, if you would like to learn more about the life of Julia Chinn, Dr.
There
Myers'
it
book,
is.
The Vice President's Black Wife: The Untold Life of Julia Chinn, is available for purchase. And purchase this book at a local Black bookstore to support Black
Please,
businesses.
please do. Please support your local and independent booksellers. Support Black bookstores and booksellers. Most independent stores, if they don't have it in stock, will order it for you. And many Black bookstores you can purchase online directly from those Black booksellers. If you can't, because sometimes you might live in a small town where you don't have a Black bookseller in your town, but you can go online and you can find them online and they are very happy to ship directly to your door. So, in honor of Black businesses and Black labor and Black History Month, please support our local Black businesses.
That's right. Now, before we leave, as we support Black businesses, if you are in the Washington, D.C. area on February 22nd, please purchase your ticket for our annual Black History Month luncheon, which will happen in Washington, D.C. on February 22nd. You can learn more about it on our website at asala.org. And if you are liking to stay with us this month for the festival, our next program is The Reshaping of Racial Labor in the Age of AI with Dr. Golden Owens on Thursday, February 13th at 5 p.m. And another program is PBS Books Conversation with Mary Frances Berry on Wednesday, February 19th at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m.
Amazing.
Eastern. So thank you all for joining us. And I would like to give a special thanks to our 2025 luncheon sponsors. You can see them on the screen. I'll leave them up for a moment for you to look at who is still supporting Black history. And
All right,
so
AARP. Yes.
that's right. So thank you all for joining us this evening and happy Black History Month.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you as well.